Next, we'd like to introduce Kate and Misha. Kate Rossiter is a co-investigator on this project, working with us through Simon Fraser University and in partnership with the Ending Violence Association of British Columbia. Misha Dhillon is a research and projects coordinator, also at the Ending Violence Association of British Columbia, and they've been focusing their work on the immigrant and refugee population. Kate and Misha will be talking about immigrant and refugee survivors' perspectives on help seeking, the gaps in help seeking, and strategies preventing domestic violence and homicide. Welcome, Kate and Misha.
Thank you so much, Annalie. I would like to begin by acknowledging that EVA BC's offices are located on the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'd also like to acknowledge the teams supporting the work that Misha and I have the honor of sharing with you today, specifically Abir Al Jamal and Dr. Mohammed Baobaid at the Muslim Resource Center for Social Support and Integration in London, Ontario, Sarah Yercich and Dr. Margaret Jackson at the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children in the School of Criminology at Simon Fraser University, and Dr. Sepali Grunge at Ryerson University. Abir and Sarah will be joining us later today for the Q&A breakout session, so we look forward to engaging with them then. In this presentation, we'll be sharing preliminary findings from our analysis of interviews with 16 immigrant and refugee women survivors of severe domestic violence across Canada. The average age of the participants was 44, and the average length of their experience of domestic violence was 8 years, ranging from less than 1 year to over 30 years of violence. More than half of the women were married at the time they experienced domestic violence, and close to 1 in 5 were living common law. The rest of the women were separated, divorced, and another 6% were in dating relationships. All but one of the women had children, and most had 2 to 3 children. Participants were from diverse cultural backgrounds and various countries of origin. They identified as Caribbean, Latina, South Asian, Southeast Asian, Middle Eastern, and Canadian. Approximately 1/3 had immigrated to Canada from European countries. While survivors had the option of participating in any language with the support of an interpreter, all interviews with immigrant and refugee women were conducted in English or French, and only English language interviews were included in our analysis. And just a note that we have used pseudonyms for all the survivors whose quotes are shared in the presentation today. Nearly 1/3 of the participants we spoke with were located in Ontario, 1/4 were located in the prairies, close to 1/5 were in BC, 2 were in Quebec, and 2 were in the Maritimes. Over 80% of participants lived in urban centers at the time they experienced domestic violence, and 19% were living in rural, remote, or northern communities at the time. We conducted a thematic analysis to make meaning of the data, starting by familiarizing ourselves with the data. We reviewed a subset of the interview transcripts and generated initial codes before meeting as a team to discuss our organization of the data and our coding. We then coded the remaining interviews in vivo and reviewed the coded data, searching for themes and meeting as a team to review and refine the emerging themes and also discuss our interpretation and analysis within a cultural context. We report on some of our preliminary findings today as we continue defining and naming the themes for future publications. I'll share a little bit about the immigrant survivors' stories. The women who participated in the study shared experiences of multiple forms of abuse, including emotional, financial, physical, sexual, and spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse, for example, involved perpetrators disapproving of survivors' worship practices and distorting their beliefs to justify the abuse. Many also shared experiences of isolation, coercive control, and criminal harassment. The majority of survivors shared that their children were also exposed to abuse. Additionally, a few survivors spoke about their fear that the perpetrator would abduct the children and not return to Canada. Survivors talked about domestic violence risk factors that are well documented in the literature, including threats of harm, separation, stalking, and strangulation. They also spoke about risk factors that were more specific to immigrant and refugee populations, such as those related to sponsorship, cultural and religious expectations, and silence surrounding domestic violence within their cultural communities. Some participants also shared stories of in-laws and other family members contributing to the domestic violence they experienced. Many factors for severe and/or lethal violence, of course, are not unique to immigrant and refugee women, but can still look different within immigrant and refugee populations. For example, isolation can mean geographic isolation, but also isolation as it relates to immigration and settlement. Survivors reflected on their experiences of violence and perceptions of domestic violence in their countries of origin, which shaped their decisions to disclose, to leave, and or to seek informal and formal supports, and it also impacted their level of risk. For example, one survivor shared that she initially did not understand the English word abuse because there was not an equivalent word in her own language. However, when abusive behaviors were described to her, she did recognize her own experience. Survivors also spoke about not being believed or being told just to be patient, to work on the relationship, to stay, reconcile, etc. Survivors were diverse in terms of their migration experiences, their length of stay in Canada, and whether they were foreign-born or second-generation immigrants. They spoke about their immigration status, their diverse experiences of abuse in relation to their migration journeys, and culture clashes with respect to gender roles and issues related to family matters. One participant shared her experience of immigrating to Canada, experiencing domestic violence, and being isolated from informal supports in her country of origin as a tactic of control. She said, "He knew I had got nowhere to go, and he didn't start getting abusive until after we were in Canada, once he'd cut me off from all of my family and all of my supports. I didn't have contact with them from the moment we got into Canada for 12 years. Yeah, he knew what he was doing." Participants articulated many barriers to help seeking, including fear, shame, self-doubt, distrust, and hope that their partner would change. Limited or ineffective informal supports, for example, family and friends living in a different country, limited financial independence, lack of access to safe and affordable housing, and limited knowledge of or access to formal supports. The next slide has two quotes that illustrate survivors' experiences of having limited access to informal and formal supports to increase their independence and safety. One said, "We were new here and he made sure that I don't have friends because every time I came home and I said, 'Hey, look, I met this couple and they're inviting us over.' And again, he would make a huge scene." And she went on to describe a huge scene as a very violent incident. "I immigrated to Canada as a political refugee, and so I'm not fully aware of all the services available in helping work here in Canada. So that was another situation that made me a little more vulnerable." Misha will later share survivors' advice for other women in overcoming some of the barriers that they shared about help-seeking support and safety. But first, I'll pass it over to her to speak to survivors' experiences with formal supports.
Thank you so much, Kate. Okay, so survivor stories about accessing formal support systems highlight some key aspects that determine whether these were effective supports. Through our ongoing analysis, we're beginning to tease out how experiences with formal support services are shaped by these survivors' identities as immigrants and as refugees. And I wanted to use our limited time today to highlight three important themes that are emerging from the data. So first, survivor stories emphasize the importance of these systems having a nuanced understanding of domestic violence. Over half of the survivors shared experiences of insufficient responses from formal supports, such as trying to get a protection order for safety concerns and being unable to. And formal supports also missed opportunities for intervention, which suggests that a better understanding of domestic violence may facilitate survivors disclosing and seeking help. So for example, this might be through building capacity to identify signs of violence. And survivor stories, secondly, emphasize the importance of formal supports being guided by survivors' needs. It was important to have accessible information about the supports themselves, especially for recent immigrants and refugees who may be unaware of services in their new community or be navigating systems that are different from those in the country of origin. Many survivors also describe navigating practical barriers to accessing formal support services, including financial barriers and services with limited availability or in impractical locations. So one survivor shared that the only shelter spot that was available to her was 6 hours away, and they were only able to hold that spot for 2 hours. More effective formal supports increased accessibility through free or low-cost services, addressing survivors' practical needs for leaving an abusive relationship, and working to accommodate each survivor's specific needs. So one of the participants gave the example of a service being able to schedule counseling for both herself and her children simultaneously, so she didn't have to worry about childcare. And survivor stories also highlighted the importance of a trauma-informed response from formal supports, where survivors really felt well supported on an ongoing basis. And lastly, survivor stories also identify gaps among formal supports, which highlights a need for better cross-sector coordination, which, for example, would enable a hospital to connect survivors with housing supports. So survivors shared examples of formal supports failing to meet their needs, sometimes causing further harm. Here, Carmen says, I remember trying to get passports for my kids. God, that was the worst experience of my life. Every time I walked into this passport office, I had to see somebody else new and talk to another person and share your story again with that person. And it was just like, yeah, here's my profile. I'm Carmen. Yes, I was beat. Yes, I was Miss Victim. This is who I am. And it's so dehumanizing. And so the experience that Carmen describes here shows how formal supports, including those that aren't specific to domestic violence, can really be re-victimizing, requiring survivors to repeatedly disclose. Survivor stories also highlighted the difficulty of finding culturally relevant support services. So here, Layla shared, when I researched therapy in Canada, I would find numbers, but it would have been nice to see something where it's like, if you prefer someone from this country or whatever, because there's a lot of subliminal stuff that only someone within the culture which really understands how it is. And this lack of culturally relevant supports was something that was also reflected in survivors' recommendations, which I am going to briefly get into next. So as part of the interview process, survivors were invited to offer some advice for informal and formal supports, as well as advice for others that were experiencing high-risk domestic violence. So participants' advice for other survivors included gaining financial, emotional, and practical independence from their abusive partner, developing safety plans, and reaching out to trusted friends and family. They also cautioned other survivors about implicitly trusting formal supports and recommended learning about both these systems and their rights, as well as advocating for themselves. Survivors' advice for informal support, so friends and family, for example, was that they first educate themselves about what domestic violence looks like and learn how to best support people in abusive relationships, including taking their concerns seriously and offering them validation, resources, as well as practical and emotional support. In their advice for formal support, survivors again emphasized the importance of accessible information and services, as well as recommending domestic violence training and education to support more formal responses. Participant stories also demonstrated how diverse the experiences and needs of immigrant and refugee survivors are, based on factors including geographic location, racialization, and socioeconomic status. So for formal supports to truly be responsive to survivors' needs, it's important that we not make assumptions about their experiences. As a key takeaway from survivors' recommendations, we wanted to share this quote from Jade, an immigrant woman who experienced 25 years of domestic violence. Her advice to service providers was to take into consideration that certain cultural norms are so strong that they might surpass certain things that you might say to that person. So they might give them some advice, but they might not realize the culture might override that. So it's better for them to say, tell me how I can be helpful to you. As survivors shared their stories of seeking safety, we also invited them to give a title to those stories, and we wanted to close today with these immigrant and refugee women's own words. And recognizing we won't have time to properly take this all in, we will be happy to share this later on today at our Q&A session. Thank you all so much. You're welcome to reach out to Kate and I over email, and we hope that some of you will be able to join us this afternoon to engage in a little bit more discussion. Thanks so much.